So Section 13. People had a lot of questions about Section 13. So how did the Song dynasty recruit officials? Why was this important? Of course, we're talking about a dynasty, so we're talking about China. Typically, when we talk about dynasties, that's China. And I apologize. Sometimes people write it Sung with a U. Sometimes they write it with an O. I did both, which is maybe a little confusing. It should be with an O, right? I should have followed the O. So my apologies there. But Sung with a U, Sung with an O, same thing. But what happened was, remember that when the Tang dynasty fell, a lot of Chinese said, you know why it fell? It's because we followed foreign ideas like Buddhism. We should turn away from Buddhism and back to Confucianism. So the Sung dynasty was very much a Confucian Chinese dynasty. And in Confucianism, you had this idea that scholar officials are important. Who should rule us? Government officials. What kind of government officials? Officials who are scholars. What do those scholars study? Confucianism. Right? So we're going to be ruled by government officials who study Confucianism. Right? They're scholars who study Confucianism. How do we know if they really understand Confucianism? Let's give them an exam. That's how you know if they really have studied Confucianism and understand Confucianism, right? Scholars are good at taking tests, right? Or making tests. Now, what's very important about this is in China, almost any male, the vast majority of males, like eunuchs and Buddhist priests were not allowed to take it, but almost any male could take this. So that meant lots of people studied the Confucian classics. And since they studied these Confucian classics, these kind of the Confucian scriptures, these things encourage loyalty and virtue. And that's how they then thought. Right? If you spend all your time studying the Bible, you will think biblically. If you spend all your time studying Confucianism, you will think like Confucius. And this helped spread Confucian values, right? Because all these people were studying for this exam, and this helped build greater unity in China because they had a shared value system. What was China's economic importance? What innovations did this revolution allow China to develop? Right? Basically, it's quite simple. The Chinese were able, through a variety of reasons that we didn't talk about, but for a variety of reasons, were able to grow their population by developing farming. They went from subsistence farming, which means farming just enough so you can survive, to growing a lot for the market. We've talked about this in class a lot, so I'll go through it very quickly. But remember, when you have food that you can go buy at a supermarket or at a market, that means you don't have to spend all your time farming. You can do something else and then go buy food, right? And once people can do something else other than farming, they can develop science and technology and all those wonderful things. So they're going to start developing a lot of different neat things. Printing presses, though not metal movable type printing, so it's a little bit different from what the Europeans will do. The compass, gunpowder, they'll figure out how to produce lots and lots of iron, and they will build this thing called the Grand Canal, which you may remember was very sophisticated. They'll also figure out how to make clocks. For some reason, they will forget how to make clocks, but they did figure them out. And they'll even establish the use of paper money. How did China manage to both lose and win against the Mongols? The answer to losing is very simple. They got conquered by the Mongols. The Sung dynasty was destroyed by the Mongols. First, the Mongols ate the first half, the top half of China, the north half, and then they ate the second half of China. So they conquered China. So that's how the Chinese lost. How did they win? Well, one thing I tried to emphasize, the Mongols were good at conquering, but they didn't really have a high civilization. So you would get conquered by the Mongols, but you would say, okay, so what? These guys were bigger and tougher than me, so they took over, right? But that doesn't mean they're better than me. You can kind of think about it this way, right? If you ever were bullied by a bigger child when you were a little kid, you didn't look up to that person who bullied you and say, I want to be like that person. You just hated them and wanted to get rid of them, and you wished you were strong enough that one day you could. Right? That's how China felt about Mongolia and the Mongol Empire. So eventually what happened is, when the Mongols became weak, the Chinese, who had maintained their identity and their civilization, overthrew the Mongols and established a new dynasty, the Ming dynasty. Remember, Ming means bright or luminous. Right? We were under the Mongol darkness. Now we're under the bright light of native Chinese rule. We've restored civilization. How was the Korean exam different in Koryo, Korea than it was in Sung, China? And the answer is actually, I'm going to take these three. I'm going to take these three questions together. How was the exam system different in Koryo, Korea than it was in Sung, China? How was Buddhism different in Koryo, Korea than it was in Sung, China? What was Heian Sa? Why was it important? So, Korea borrowed the Chinese civil service exams, and Koreans said we should be governed by scholar officials who study Confucianism. So it sounds the same, right? One key difference. Korea was an aristocratic society with like dukes and lords and nobles and that kind of thing. And so they said, we're not going to let any male take the exam. Only aristocrats can take the exam. In China, basically any male could take the exams. But in Korea, only aristocrats could take the civil service exams, right? Only aristocrats could take the civil service exams. So that's a key difference. In terms of how their Buddhism is different, remember in China, Confucianism had become weaker. I'm sorry, in China, Buddhism had become a lot weaker. The government, many Chinese people were still Buddhists, but the government didn't care much about Buddhism, didn't give much money to support Buddhism like it had in the Tang Dynasty. However, in colonial Korea, Buddhist influence remained strong. How strong? The Koreans built a huge temple with 80,000 wood blocks. And on each one of these wood blocks was carved a page of the Buddhist Bible, with the idea that they could then print lots and lots of Buddhist Bibles. Their Bible was 80,000 pages long. That's a long Bible, right? And this is what Haein-sa Temple was. They built this temple to store these wood blocks. And they believed that by building this temple, they would get lots of good karma, the Buddhas would favor them, and would protect them from foreign invasion. Right? That was the idea. Some people did invade Korea, though, and burnt down the temple, but such was their faith in Buddhism that they didn't say, oh, I guess it didn't work. They said, let's do it again. And they rebuilt it, and you can go visit it today. So that answered those questions. What were the characteristics of the Japanese emperor? Why was there only one Japanese dynasty but many Chinese dynasties? And those two questions go together, right? In Japan, what's kind of curious is the Japanese emperor would lose power but stay on the throne. In China or Korea, if the monarch lost power, they got rid of him and put up a new monarch. But in Japan, they didn't do that. If you wanted power in China, you had to become emperor. If you wanted power in Korea, you had to become the king. But in Japan, if you wanted power, you didn't try and become the emperor, you tried to control the emperor. And you may say, well, why would you do it that way? Why not just try and take over? Well, that's because in China and Korea, they believed in the mandate of heaven. They said heaven chooses the most moral person in their family, their dynasty, to rule. But in Japan, they said our emperor is emperor not because of the mandate of heaven, but because he's descended from the sun goddess. So I could try, if I want power in China, I can say, okay, heaven has chosen me, I'm going to lead a rebellion, and if I successfully lead my rebellion, boom, I've got power. But in Japan, I can't suddenly say, oh, I'm descended from the sun goddess, because everyone knows I'm not, right? I have to be from the emperor's family if I want to be emperor. I can't, they'll just say, you're not part of that family, you're a Roush. You know, Roushes are not descended from the sun goddess. So they can't remove the emperor because he is descended from the sun goddess and they're not. So what happens is, initially, aristocratic families will rule through the emperor. The aristocrats will seize power from the emperor, but they don't get rid of the guy. They just rule through him. And the emperors will increasingly then focus not on a political role, but on a religious role, which makes sense, right? Their claim to legitimacy is because they're descended from the sun goddess. So what were the characteristics of the Japanese aristocrats, the people who were ruling Japan through the emperor during the Heian period? How about the tale of Genji, right? So we have there's a story, the story of Genji, we could call it. One thing, the aristocrats, they had borrowed Buddhism, right, from China. And they focused on Buddhism in a kind of interesting way. They focused on its aesthetics, its sense of beauty. So they took that idea and had this idea, we should develop sensitivity, especially about the gloom over the impermanence of life. Right? Everything we love, all the beautiful things in this world, Buddhism teaches us that they are transitory, that they will change, that we will lose them. So we should be sensitive to that. We should write poems about that and how sad we are that things change. Right? Those were kind of the values. And we see these especially in the tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki. Right? In this story, she develops this kind of idea of emotional sensitivity and of an appreciation of beauty. Remember, we watched a video clip, the anime clip, right? Where they had Genji was trying to, what can I say? His lover was very unhappy because they could never marry, and Genji was trying to comfort her, and failing miserably, even though he was very sensitive and in touch with his emotions. I did not like that clip, but I had to show you because it's the right thing to do. But that's kind of the idea that's connected. So What's also important for us to understand is this reflects the development of Japanese writing. Before this time, Japanese people wrote in Chinese, which is very difficult. Think about it this way: if you're a native English speaker, think about trying to write in French. Speak English, write French. It's kind of weird, right? But that's what Japanese people are trying to do. However, they eventually developed their own style of writing, which was close to their spoken language. So Lady Murasaki spoke Japanese, and because they developed Japanese writing, she could now write in Japanese. And she wrote The Tale of Genji, which is the first vernacular novel, the first novel in the everyday language of the people. What was the original relationship between Japanese aristocrats and samurai? How did it change and why? Well, remember, the aristocrats, they control the emperor. That's where they get their power from. But the problem is they get their money from farms. But they want to be close to the emperor, who's in the capital, but they get their money from farms, which are far from the capital. So they have a problem. So they hired samurai to take care of their farms, their manors, which were tax-free. They didn't have to pay tax on them, so they made a lot of money that way. So they hired the samurai to govern their lands for them while they stayed in the capital so they could control the emperor. Eventually, the samurai figured out that these guys were a bunch of wimps who were in touch with their emotions, and they could just beat them up and take their farms, which is what the samurai did. Eventually, the samurai said, these aristocrats are very weak. We're doing all this hard work for them, protecting their land. Let's just take the land for ourselves. So the samurai will eventually take over, and they'll push out the aristocrats. So you'll go from the aristocrats control the emperor, and the samurai work for the aristocrats. That's how it starts. But then the samurai will say, the aristocrats are weak, kick out the aristocrats, stop working for them, and then they will control the emperor. Right, so the samurai will eventually take over, and then they will control the emperor. And the first guy who does this successfully is a samurai named Minamoto Yoritomo. Right, Minamoto Yoritomo is the first guy to do this successfully. He forms a warrior coalition, pushes the aristocrats from power, and seizes power for the samurai. And the emperor will name him shogun, and we call his kind of government a shogunate. What's a shogun and a shogunate? Well, shogunate is ruled by the shogun, right? Very simple. And a shogun literally just means general, like a general in the army. Shogun just means general. So, so he will. Then the samurai shogun will take power. He will have political power, and the emperor will still focus on religious rule. What was the shogun? What was the relationship between him and the Japanese emperor? We just did that one. Why were the Japanese able to avoid being conquered by the Mongols? There's two big reasons for that. One, of course, is that now when the Mongols invade, Japan was fortunate to have a military government in power. Right? So it's good when you're facing military problems to have soldiers have some power. Right? They had effective warriors in charge of Japan when the Mongols invaded. That's very helpful. The other thing, though, that helped was the kamikaze, the divine winds. When the Mongols invaded, and they invaded twice, both times they got hit by really, really bad storms, what we would call typhoons. But what the Japanese refer to as kamikaze. Kaze is wind. Kami can mean spirit or divine. So they were hit by divine wind. Right? So the Japanese said, aha, our emperor is descended from a god. We are the land of the gods. So naturally the gods intervened to protect us against those evil Mongols. And of course, later on in Japanese history, when they were thinking about when they were threatened by a foreign threat, when the United States forces were approaching them during World War II, they resurrected this idea, but applied it to Japanese fighter planes that were being used to smash into American ships. Remember, this is the USS Columbia, named after our state's capital. And that it didn't sink, but that plane did hit the poor ship. We went over all these other terms. We didn't go over Tangun. Who was Tangun? Remember, the Koreans were invaded by the Mongols, and they actually were subjugated by the Mongols, and the Korean king was forced to marry a Mongol princess. So over time, the Korean kings became increasingly Mongolian. And it was at this time that the story of Tangun was first written down, and it asserts that Koreans were different, that they were special, that they were different from those Mongols. And according to this legend, remember the Son of God came down from heaven, and a tiger and a bear approached him and said that they wanted to be human beings. The Son of God said they could become human beings if they lived in a cave for 30 days, eating nothing but garlic. The tiger couldn't do it, but the bear could. The bear became a beautiful lady, and married the son of God, and they had their son, this guy, Tangun. Right? So Tangun is the son of a bear turned into a woman and the son of God, and Koreans said that was our first ruler. Right? He taught our people civilization, and we Koreans are his children, so we Koreans are special people. So in that way they could assert how they're different from those Mongols. This helped them maintain their identity, saying we're different from the Mongols, so the Mongols became weak. They were then able to restore their independence through this means. Okay. So as we've been doing to try and, I know people get tired of just hearing me talk.